Varun will be our host for the 15 minutes. So let me quickly introduce Varun, our amazing managing director of GFI India. I think actually a lot of people in the audience are actually already following Varun and his team's great work. And I mean, Varun is doing so much amazing work in such a complex, country, building things from the ground up, really. I can't think of a better host for this session, as Varun and his team have already been conducting several projects in the area of indigenous crops, including pulses and millets. So I will let him tell you all about it in this session titled Grown in Asia, Competitive Advantage in Diversifying Raw Materials for Plant-Based Meat. So take it away, Varun.
All right, thank you so much, Elaine. I hope everyone has already had a good morning and is having a great time during the Asia Summit on Alternative Proteins. I'm going to first introduce our wonderful panel, and then I'm going to quickly launch into the session, which is, of course, Grown in Asia. We're still waiting for Julie, our third panelist, but I will go ahead and introduce Nithiya and V. Nithiya Laila is a culinary anthropologist and an Asian Academy Awards nominated television host. She comes from a long line of farmers who reap the fruits of land for both nourishment and healing. Nithiya's philosophy of sustainability and conscious consumption informs her approach to food, and she works with local farmers in Singapore to celebrate the intersection of heritage and environment in a Brunch Bandits social dining session and farmers markets that she runs. From healing Asian superfood brunches at the Sofitel in Singapore to soul food brunches that serve up cuisines from the West Indies to Ethiopia and Sri Lanka, these are exactly the kinds of things that make us in India extremely jealous and make me want to come to Singapore and hang out with Nithiya and go to some of her lunches. But until then, I and all of you can watch her work in her latest TV series on Channel News Asia, which is called Edible Wild. And I should say, by the way, that each and every one of these wonderful panelists that we have a bio that runs long enough that I could take up the majority of the session just talking about them, right? But I have abridged these bios. You should definitely go check out all of our panelists later. Nguyen is a director of research at the Asia Research and Engagement Organization. I think you all may have heard from Ben yesterday, who works with V, and she leads their sustainable protein work across Asia. V has nearly 2 decades of banking and finance experience. She was just alluding to her banking days, her trading days. She gained from working for major banks and financial institutions in Asia and Australia. But prior to transitioning into ESG and sustainable finance, she also worked at Standard Chartered Bank as an investment strategist. She's an equity specialist, having held positions in research and strategy globally with direct investment experience across Asia and Australia. And V is currently working on a research report on diverse sources of protein with our APAC team, which should be out in November. And lastly, we hope that Julie will join us soon. She's a technical and business leader for Ingredion's Global Plant Protein Strategy and Innovation Program. And she leads Ingredion's future growth in alternative proteins, which includes things like peas, lentils, faba, chickpea, etc. She's been with Ingredion for 4 years, previously spent 20 years at the Hershey Company. Julie has earned her master's degree from Drexel in food science and nutrition, bachelor's in food science from Penn State University, 5 US patents, 1 additional patent pending approval, very active in all the plant-based foods associations. And we hope she'll join us soon. But in the meantime, we're just going to get started. I am going to go ahead and talk a little bit about the context for Grown in Asia and the diverse sources of crops as well as proteins that we have access to in the continent. I need to present my screen. So if someone can help me to present my screen, that would be great. I don't currently have the button available here to present. Oh, that I do. Never mind. Right. Nithiya, can you see this? Is this working? Yes, it is. Okay, great. So yeah, of course, the session is titled Grown in Asia. We're going to be talking about the specific competitive advantage that we have in Asia as a broad region in diversifying the raw materials for plant-based meat. And you might ask, many of you in the audience are very sophisticated viewers who already know the context here, but you might still ask, why do we need to do this? Why do we need to think about diversifying raw materials within plant-based meat and eggs and dairy? Well, the basic truth and the really simple fact here is that of all the calories consumed by humans, 70% come from only 15 crops. And actually over 50% of those in total, 50% of the total comes from wheat, maize, and rice. This is the kind of monoculture or industrialization that leads to all sorts of problems. And of course, we know that some of the reason for this, a significant portion of the reason for this, whether it's crops like soy, wheat, etc., is in fact the industrialization of animal agriculture. So we have this problem, we have this proposition, and many people have already talked about this, right? From Bill Gates to the folks at companies like Just and Beyond Meat. A lot of people have talked about the fact that we need to diversify our sources of ingredients for food innovation in general. We also have the added dimension in our region, and I can speak, of course, to India, but also to Southeast Asia, Indonesia, etc. We have the added dimension of this challenge of malnutrition. So if you look at the things that enable people to shape their destiny, that allow people to live thriving, fulfilled, flourishing lives, one of the things that impedes that ability is malnutrition. And we have some of the highest cohort rates of malnutrition anywhere in the world. If you're talking about iron deficiency anemia, neural tube defects, protein energy malnutrition, all sorts of micronutrient and macronutrient deficiencies that are truly tragic and challenging for our status as a region, for us to take our place at the forefront of science and technology and all of these things that are ongoing around the world, especially in India, we have this challenge. Now, on the other side of this equation, we also have this huge advantage, right? We have a huge farmer cohort population. We have this inherent agricultural biodiversity that's existed for millennia. If we're talking about companies in the West that are making products from mung beans and pea protein, our region produces the most pulses in the world. The mung bean has been cultivated in India for over 4,500 years. There are all sorts of other agricultural biodiverse crops that are cultivated all across Asia, right? The bambara nut, millets, hemp, pongamia, all of these really interesting things that we should be utilizing in our sector. And these farmers are, in fact, the ones who cultivate these crops are a huge proportion of our population as well. And so we have the opportunity to leverage this workforce. This sounds like an odd, almost a fake statistic, but it's true. Farmers are more than 50% of India's workforce and 41% of Indonesia's. If you look at the percentage of our economies that rely on farming and agriculture, it's a huge chunk. And this is true in other places as well, right? In the Philippines and in other regions of Asia as well. So this is the ultimate proposition that I'm putting in front of you today. Food security and livelihoods have been issues that we grapple with all the time in places like India. And we think that alternative proteins can create really lucrative end markets and benefit everyone across that chain, whether it's farmers, whether it's malnutrition populations, and whether it's the average consumer, you and I, that wants to go into a grocery store and try a diverse product. So I might go into a retail location and I might want to try something that's made from pulses, and my mother might want to go in and try something that's made from millets, right? And that is definitely true. She would definitely want to go in and try something that's made from millets. But we won't get there without concerted effort. And I'm going to stop now because I think this concerted effort has to come from everyone in the audience today. It has to come from, of course, companies like Just and Beyond Meat and their counterparts in Asia. So for example, if you look at the expo, you'll see a couple of companies doing really interesting work in this area, like WTH Foods is making really great products out of biodiverse sources in places like the Philippines. And it also has to come with concerted effort from people like our wonderful panelists, whom I want to hand over to right now. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to start talking about some of these questions that we have. So my first question is for Nithiya. I want us to have a better sense of the backdrop against which we're having this conversation. Now, from your experience, would you please expand a little bit about this tremendous diversity I've just talked about in Asia's both farming as well as eating culture? I think you may be on mute. Oh.
think you're on,
Yeah,
right?
I
If you can refresh usually refreshing it fixes everything. So just refresh it. Okay.
Okay, so in the meantime, I think I'm going to go ahead with my second question, which is for V. So V, you know, the base ingredients for this diverse array of raw materials is all in place, right, for alternative proteins in Asia. But when it comes to actually translating that into a thriving innovation ecosystem and bringing products to market, there's still a lot of work to be done. So could you lay out some of the challenges from your own research at a high level for doing this?
Yeah, well, like first, diversity in raw materials using alternative proteins, but I'm not sure that it's actually enough. And this was actually the basis of the research we're currently conducting with GFI APAC. If I could just quickly mention, you know, what we're trying to achieve here is the aim was to find opportunities for Asia to support the growth in alternative proteins, especially at the beginning of the supply chain. So, you know, like the end of the downstream has been quite well documented, consumer tastes and demands and expectations, but at the beginning of the supply chain, not so much discussion so far. And we sought to see if there was a greater diversification that was actually possible, and to see which countries and then which landscapes in Asia that had enabling conditions for this to occur. So as you've alluded to, raw materials such as soy, pea and wheat have actually formed the basis for most plant protein products, alternative protein products out there currently on the market. And, you know, we all know about the environmental implications of this from sourcing from a handful of monoculture crops, you know, nutrient depletion in soil over time, biodiversity loss, leads to increased susceptibility to pathogens, which leads to increased use of fungicides and pesticides, leads to land water contamination, pollution, all these issues. But also from a consumer point of view, they're becoming much more sophisticated. They demand high quality, differentiated products. So the question is, how can one make a differentiated product downstream if everyone in the market is using the same core ingredients upstream? So product differentiation then comes down from either a difference in one, quality of your raw ingredients used. Secondly, in your production process to change the characteristics or the functional aspects of the ingredients. And thirdly, the use of additives. You could do that to create different flavors and textures. There's issues with all three of these. First, number one is difficult. Quality depends on origin, seasonality, rainfall, things you can't necessarily control, right? So it can add to the cost if you need to source also raw ingredients far away from where your manufacturing facilities are. If there's yield is low in a bad season, or you change suppliers due to issues with quality. Number two, it can be problematic because the more processing required equates to a longer time to market, equals higher costs, equals more capital investment if you choose to do it yourself. Number three is also typically less palatable to consumers these days, and it also adds costs. Consumers are looking more and more for nutrient-dense whole foods, and they want it as a lower cost as possible. So as I see it, the major upstream issues that the ecosystem kind of faces are identifying which crops for use in alternative proteins and where did they grow best, and kind of being much more forward thinking about it. What happens with climate change? You know, it's an issue that's widely spoken about and we're trying to address globally. Are these crops going to be climate resilient? And then there's the issue of sourcing and scalability of production, you know, which has to address existing infrastructure availability within each market, within the region, from both an agricultural and crop cultivation perspective, as well as the manufacturing aspect of things. So this has to take into account, you know, where you source the ingredient from and their current farming systems within Asia. A lot of supply, as you've mentioned, Varun, of soft commodities comes from, you know, farmers, like smallholder farmers in particular. Then how do you then scale that up? If you're sourcing from multiple suppliers, smaller suppliers, how do you scale up? Technology can be an answer, but that depends on the size of land and how technologically savvy the farmer is. I mean, like, drones are great. They're being used in agriculture, but it's useless in a small plot of land, right? They have limited value. what is the regulation and rule of law like within the countries where the crops are actually grown or the manufacturing takes place? Are there supportive regimes, taxes, subsidies that you had to contend with? And how do you use current resources that are already there, and you can leverage off of you can leverage off existing production systems? So, for instance, in agriculture, intercropping or crop rotation are ways that can increase overall yield for one plot of land. You don't face issues of obtaining additional land concessions, and you can improve the livelihoods of farmers who can get more out of their land and therefore, help convince them to actually grow different crops. And finally, all these upstream issues, if addressed correctly, will impact overall the cost of a product when brought to the market, which is what downstream consumers, particularly in Asia, are very conscious of.
Yeah, and I want to pause there. I want to go back to the question on culture. So Nithiya, to repeat the question was about, can you just lay out the backdrop for some of this in terms of the Asia's eating culture, as well as I think the supply and how farmers think about this? I still can't hear you, I don't think. Yes, go ahead.
Okay, I'm just going to take off my headphones and go ahead. So I think Asia, is incredibly diverse, from our culture, our religion, our languages, right down to the biodiversity of our forests and what we grow, from our farmers. And I think we do historically a lot of complementary farming. So if you're planting rice as a crop, then you would also have sesame seeds and probably chili being planted alongside for various reasons, because the farmer is not only supplying a cash crop, he's also looking for the ingredients he's going to need to feed his family for the year, right? So there is that kind of cultural practice in farming, kind of very basic permaculture principles being applied. But what we're seeing also is because of the religion in the region, right? There's Hinduism, there's Buddhism, and that heavily influences how much vegetarianism is part of our diets as well. So this kind of familiarity with alternative protein has been around for, I think, hundreds and thousands of years in Asia. We see it becoming increasingly more processed since the 80s, with all your soy-based protein. But I think something that I used to wonder about that we see is how South America, also a very tropical, very diverse continent, has kind of done a very good promotion of their super grains and the diversity of the produce, like how avocado has blown up in Asia in the last 10 to 20 years. Quinoa, and then all the problems we've seen happen with those two crops. So I think there is a model that we can reference to think on how we approach alternative meat production and the ingredients and how they are used with farmers in Asia. But I think culturally, we are very familiar with plant-based food. Most of our recipes, about 80%, if you look at traditional recipes, look at plant-based kind of alternatives. It could be a very heavy use of things like sorghums, of a variety of millets, to jackfruit. And the thing with jackfruit that's becoming also very popular now, and we've seen it as nangka curry in Malay cuisine. You see it used a lot in Kerala cuisine. It can feed the world in terms of calories, but even though it's being kind of promoted as a meat substitute, it has very little protein. You still have to turn to things like mung beans, your red beans, your black beans, and all the amaranth that we have as well, which is a great, great, great plant, right? Down from the grains to the green amaranth that you can eat the leaves. So I think there is a lot of options in Asia. We have a lot of superfoods. It's testing. I think there's not enough research being done on particular ingredients. Even in the herbal medicines, if you look at Ayurveda or Siddha medicine or Jamu in this region, they have very good references for ingredients with purported kind of healing properties, nutrition properties, huge nutritional density in terms of healing. but there's not enough scientific research behind it to back them up. So ingredient companies worldwide can use them. So the availability is there, the diversity is there, the cultural kind of familiarity with alternative meats is there. It's access, it's connection, it's collaboration that still we have to work on, I think. Where did Varun go? Has Varun left us?
I'll ask you the question and you can ask me.
I cannot believe this is happening. Video was looking good, and then this happened.
It's diversity, right? Like it's musical chairs. You keep moving around.
Okay, I need a minute to like pick this up. Could you like continue what you were talking about? Oh my God.
So I'm going to pretend to be Varun, and I'm going to ask V a question.
Thank you.
So V, I think we've talked about the cultural aspect, but in terms of the research that you do and the kind of business side of where you think alternative meats would have an impact on in terms of production and value and kind of rights for farmers, where do you think that's going? Oh, sorry, Varun, I was just pretending.
Oh, he's back.
Of course that would happen.
Okay.
Sorry, of course that would happen. No, I was actually starting to respond to what you were saying, Nithiya, and I agree 100%. In fact, like with a lot of what we encounter in India, a lot of the interest in our space and a lot of the general, almost even opposition is, okay, there's burgers in the US, all right, and Americans eat 3 beef burgers a week, which is just crazy pants for all sorts of reasons. So if you replace 1 beef burger a week with a Beyond Burger, it's the equivalent of taking 12.2 million cars off the road or powering 2.3 million additional homes. But it's also an easier problem to solve. They've put in dozens of millions of dollars, gone public as a company, etc. But in places like India, people always tell me, we actually change our eating culture every 200 kilometers. So how are you going to actually appeal to that wide swath of interests and cultures, which is really, really interesting. So yeah, I wanted to ask then a question to V, because there is, as you mentioned, there's a lot that's going on the supply side, but I think from the perspective of R&D and commercialization in these diverse crops as well, and perhaps I can also come in if you'd like me to come in on some of this stuff. We don't have Julie currently, but there are really interesting crops that are coming down the pipeline. Like we've seen oats, for example. They've had a 30-40 year journey with Oatly and are now absolutely dominating the plant-based dairy market. So could you talk a little bit about the different crops that you've seen that are becoming more and more interesting within this landscape? Because you do need to scale up, right? You can't have 1,000 different sources. You need to do the R&D, scale up some of them, and then keep expanding the diversity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what's really been clear about our research in this so far is that, like I said before, it's not just about diversifying into a few more crops, right? What you need is like ideally hundreds, but then how do we manage, like, how do we scale that up so it's actually meaningful? And how do we do it in a way that is responsive to the dynamics of the region? And Nithiya pointed to, like, actually the question that you were asking me, Nithiya, before Varun joined us, about, farmers. That's really important, right? So really, it really starts at the very beginning, which is the raw ingredients used in the first place, your choice of that. And there are some new innovative companies have really looked into the kind of raw inputs they're using to start with, and they're already being used locally. So that helps, therefore they can thrive within the existing landscapes and the conditions here. I think we mentioned before in previous discussions, a clear one being used by NAMS is Bambara nut. And they're using it, I believe they're sourcing it from Malaysia. It can be grown on degraded arable land, which is really quite key. And it's already being used by local communities. Why is that so important is that because of the impacts in Malaysia and places like Indonesia of oil palm cultivation. There's diminishing yield over time with oil palm, and a large part of that is due to the diminishing soil fertility. So what do you do with that land afterwards? When you can't get as much out of it. These alternative crops may be the answer. You know, they thrive on that. That's perfect. You don't have to wrestle with land concessions within certain, you know, provinces and landscapes that it might be quite difficult to navigate. You know, like, yeah, so like really at the beginning, the core ingredient that you use, you know, other things like amaranth and moringa, and, you know, actually the FAO published in 2018 a really good report on the future foods. Yeah, probably Nithiya, if you read it. It's, you know, there's a whole table there of alternatives that have been used locally for quite some time.
Also, I wanted to add on to that. Like, I think, you know, as I was hearing what you were saying, I think the kind of alternative meat startup scene, the way we're seeing now, right? It's they can sit in a very like great middle ground, because what we're seeing is a breakdown, especially with the pandemic, in the kind of distribution and the logistics of kind of fresh ingredients from the region getting to Singapore, for example, right? But with the processing that alternative meat companies are doing, you know, they create a consistent supply, so restaurants would use them, so hawkers would use them, and you're not at the mercy so much as you would be to the seasonality and the availability of an ingredient. So like kind of moringa, as you mentioned, hyacinth bean, velvet beans, all the various beans that we have, and especially jackfruit that Karana is doing, where they process it so it lasts a bit longer, and you don't just have 1 or 2 days. So I think it's going to change how we have access to food, our familiarity with food, as well as all these alternative meat companies also have such solid branding because they're startups. So the promotion of it, it kind of almost reintroduces certain ingredients to the next generation of Asian consumers. And that we're seeing that as well, I think. Like people rediscovering jackfruit in Singapore and the region. So yeah. I think that's going to happen. So that's a positive, I feel.
And it's interesting what you just said, right? Like everything that's novel is actually ancient. These novel ingredients that are in our sector are things like millets, hemp, bambara nut, moringa. There's, by the way, great comments that are coming in. So people are highlighting companies like What If Foods. You just mentioned Karana. I want to ask a couple of questions then about, you know, the fact that we actually don't have meat on the center of the plate in Asia, right? Which presents its own sort of challenges. And we also have the opportunity then to blend this kind of tradition, which really is ancient Asian tradition, into modernity by utilizing those local ingredients in local dishes. So you have essentially the familiar that's being blended in with plant-based meats, right? And of course, that's satisfying needs that have existed for a very long time as well. So could you speak to some of the unique approaches and formats that you've seen, which are satisfying meat demand? So you mentioned Karana, Nithiya. Could you talk about some of the other companies and the types of dishes and really interesting things that you're seeing that are super promising?
I think we're seeing, I mean, with What If Foods as well, with their bambara nut instant noodles, I think. There's Nams as well that's doing that, and they're trying to also use that to create alternative dairy. They're trying to also create yogurt and, you know, that kind of spread of products. But I think what I'm also very interested in is the cell-based research that's going in, algae-based research into creating alternative seafood and different other kinds of high-protein meats. So those are kind of startup companies. A-Star is doing a lot of research on it here, and I think that's quite fun. But it's also insects. I think insects have historically been kind of eaten in Southeast Asia. And I think they're definitely going to come back into fashion as a high protein source. Right now, they're being eaten in their raw, kind of direct grilled or fried form. And I think we're going to see it more kind of in like burgers, dumplings, paos, so where they're processed a bit more. So I think those are the kind of things I'm excited about. But historically, you know, we see tempeh as something that takes a kind of a star take on it. But also the kind of fermented breads of India, you know, are very high protein and also the way they are processed. So, from your appams to your dokla in Gujarat to, you see like they bring protein to your diet. So I think we need to break down those the kind of more Western pyramid idea of nutrition. Carbs, meat, vegetables, dairy, and kind of maybe follow a more ancient Asian way of eating, which is 80% plant-based, 20% meat or seafood, and see where the alternative meats are going to come in to play in that area with an increasing middle class across the developing world.
Yeah, and so again, coming back to that idea, I think of tradition meeting modernity or colliding with modernity. You actually see a lot of the habits that the West went through over the last decades actually coming to the fore in places like India and Southeast Asia now, where the demand for meat in this region is expected to continue skyrocketing, let's say, over the next decade. So if you look at the FAO map of the growth in poultry demand from 2020 to 2030, the hottest zone, the reddest zone is South Asia, which is India. And then you have Southeast Asia. You, of course, have China, mainland China. And then, of course, there are other parts of the world like Latin America, et cetera, which are growing as well. But most of the hottest zones are all in this region. And so our fear or our area of interest or opportunity, let's frame it that way, is in actually plugging that demand with things that taste the same or better and cost the same or less, right? Now, I think a lot of that will have to contend with scale, because we have to balance this idea of utilizing these diverse sources with what can actually scale across the region. Let's say, for example, any of these companies we're discussing had to scale up their products. They would have to go into things like contract farming and things in a much larger way, right? So V, could you talk a little bit about what you've seen in your investigations about the challenges and the opportunities that exist within that space? Are there any things that you've seen that raise challenges on contract farming and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, like, obviously, if you can use existing infrastructures, that is to your benefit. You're going to be able to bring something to market much faster, right? And the challenge for the smaller end, the new innovators, the startups that are going into this space is exactly what you said, is how do we scale up? How do we establish our supply chain? And the supply chain is core and key to this. And it's not just about the raw material itself, but also, like, there's two parts to it. The raw material being processed into the protein isolate, and then the isolate being used for the food manufacture. And you need to secure that. And I think we are seeing a lot of, obviously, commodity players. The large commodity players are all starting to go into the alternative protein space. There was a huge fanfare at the beginning of this year, with Yum Foods, and Cargill doing a JV and supplying plant-based chicken nuggets in China. I think KFC, I believe it was. And if you speak to, you will see now all the major commodity players, whether they're commodity trading and not listed, or they are actually agricultural firms, they are all starting to move into this space. And it's actually quite natural, right? What you got is, if you are a pea producer and or like soy or anything else, and you've got this meal produced, and but you can see there's what you normally wouldn't use, what can you make out of that? And you've got this, the supply chain has already been set up. So you don't have that challenge. But even so, but even these large firms, like I know for CB Group, they have extensive presence globally and within the region, and they're a fully integrated firm. They do from feed to farm to table. They have a lot of contract farmers, and they're not just like a couple of hundred. It's in the tens of 10,000. And these firms are working with the farming community, we believe, to improve processes, to ensure quality of product, and to help from everything from their financing, so they have the equipment that they need, to being able to use technology, which can be as simple as using a smartphone, and that they're helping them along the way with courses, etc., like business and running your farm, and supplying them with the feed, etc. But Yeah, that definitely has to be addressed, because it's quite unique to this region, is that a lot of the supply still comes from, a good chunk of it comes from smallholder farmers.
And
And that's something we really have to address.
And in fact, many of those smallholder farmers are they're subsistence farmers in many cases, right? And so the move actually has been in recent decades to connect subsistence farmers to markets in a way that hasn't happened in the past.
Actually, I have to say that I'm not sure about India, but in some of our interviews, it's come out that actually our perception of a smallholder farmer is in the backyard farm. You know, they're growing it, they're selling some of it to market, they're using it, some of themselves, as food source. But actually, there's two categories of smallholder farmers. You have that category, and they're the ones who are not going to be so open to, embracing technology, or they're quite older, they've inherited this plot of land, they just want to live peacefully, and so it's subsistence, survival. And then there's a whole nother class now, which is coming out, and they're actually quite technologically savvy. They want to grow their land concessions. They want to look at how they can increase yield. And it's another generation. And a lot of them are actually come from urban areas. And I think that space, that space is the space that is going to help answer some of the issues, address some of the issues that we have with scaling up. Because they have the desire and the capacity, to do so.
I think something that I've seen as well in terms of working with a variety of farmers is a lot of them are looking at what they can do with what has been like a waste crop, right? So for example, if you're growing aloe vera to help your soil recover after particularly heavy agricultural session, or legumes, or different kinds of grass, cereal grains, for example, then you're going to cut it all down. And they're like, what can I do with this? And they don't have the capacity a lot of the times to handle the processing themselves. So I think when a kind of a company, a startup or something that's fusing it, I'll take the raw aloe vera, I'll make aloe vera, dehydrated aloe vera that's going to go into a pea protein shake, then that helps. Or when you take banana stems and say, I'm going to make this into banana silk, so it also goes into the biodegradable packaging side of things, where a lot of the waste products can go. So I think when the relationship with the farmer is more of support instead of perhaps monopoly, or it's trying to make sure the power dynamics are not so screwed, where I think when you're partnering up with smallholder farms to kind of get your produce, versus buying over the land and then contracting the farmers. And we see a lot of that happening as well with larger companies, where they were just I'll buy over your land, and then I'm going to bring contract farmers in. And then you're disenfranchising the community, especially with ancient land that's been passed down through generations. So when hopefully those things do not happen in Asia as we go further into the alternative.
Yeah, exactly right. And you're right that those are the two big buckets into which people fall. And in fact, even with the previous generation of smallholder farmers, sometimes their children who have maybe moved on to live in urban environments don't necessarily want to go back to the land, especially if it's smallholder farming. Farming has not been sexy to them, right? For lack of a better word, it's not something that they necessarily may want to do. And this is a vast generalization, but you get the point that I'm making. I think that your point, Nithiya, is exactly right. The disintermediation of the farming community is something that has been critiqued a lot in places like India. I guess on the flip side of that, when it comes to governments creating protectionist policies for farmers, sometimes you can land up in a worse situation than otherwise, right? So I think we need to strike the right balance. So India is, for example, well documented as a region in which our agricultural output does not even come close to meeting agricultural biodiversity, our agroclimatic zones, the farming, labor force we have, even though a lot of them are subsistence farmers. Even if you account for all of that, we don't even come close to punching at our weight, right? So these are things to all, I think, consider. And hopefully we as a sector, the alternative protein sector, can offer some sort of lucrative end markets without disintermediating those communities. Going back to the question, I think, about diversity versus scaling up, there is that underlying tension, right? So for both of you, speaking from your experience, what have you seen in terms of what you can predict moving forward? I'm sure people in the audience want to know what the next great crop is that they can invest in right now, and that can be the next oat milk like tomorrow. But what have you seen in terms of, is it going to be a handful of hero ingredients which dominate due to their inherent functionality and the value chain and other properties? Or is it possible that we'll see a more diverse array of inputs with, let's say, 1,000 startups, each, not each farming a different thing, but you get the point that I'm making, doing a lot in the agri supply to create this diversity?
From a culture perspective, I will definitely say diversity will be the healthiest option, right? So no crop becomes a monocrop or gets cash cropped, and there's a huge diversity. So that would be ideal scenario. Although, of course, from business side, as B's probably going to say, branding, promoting, trying to educate your consumers about 1,000 ingredients is a lot harder than jumping on kind of 2 or 3 ingredients. But I think some of the most exciting things we're seeing is algae, seaweed, insects, and also the kind of variety of grains that we have here that are not fully explored. I think even looking at kind of, I work with some very small farmers in Sarawak and Sabah, as well as some of the Indonesian islands. And the variety they have there, even in the types of ginger, the types of turmeric, the kind of different kinds of grains, arrowroot, cassava, tapioca, like all this stuff that they have, and the variety of each species, it's insane, and they also have avocados growing in Sri Lanka and in Borneo. So I think hopefully I'm looking forward to more education on the variety of ingredients that there are in the region, which is easily accessible, that can be easily referenced for alternative meat companies to experiment with in their labs.
So we have a number of great comments coming in. Please go ahead. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, it's all right. Yeah, I would absolutely. Ideally, I would like to see like hundreds of new ingredients out there, but in practicality, Nithiya's already guessed, that's going to be limited. But what's really interesting is that nutrition is a big deal now, right? So what I think where we're going to move is actually like people are going to look at an ingredient as a, excuse me, especially in terms of protein. Is it a complete protein? Because not all the base products going into alternative proteins are complete proteins. They're missing some amino acids, etc. So firstly, you're going to look at like your meal as to balance out your nutritional value. The fact that nutrition is a focus, and that translates down into, so your whole foods are going to be front and center. I mean, we've seen that so much already, right? Chia, quinoa, these kind of things. The thing, and I think it's already been touched on in this conversation, is that we have to be careful in that if demand increases so fast, where's the supply going to be from? And if that's, to meet that demand, and therefore, is it going to have implications and impacts for the growers in certain areas and regions? Nithiya mentioned it before, quinoa, it was this kind of unknown ingredient used by in Peru and Bolivia, and all of a sudden, bang, it's on every menu across the world, and it's been well documented about the fallout from that. So it depends, but yes, nutritional whole foods is really I think where it's going. But there's a whole other aspect that we haven't really talked about, is that protein has always been, when you look about alternative proteins, you think, what is the meat and seafood substitute? But you can have the protein, in Asia, we eat a lot of noodle and rice, right? That's the carb, but you can put the protein content into the noodle. And that's what's happening in the innovative front now, is that's where the nutrition is actually coming from. What is the starch and carbohydrate content of your meal? And the other thing is too, that what the region really does offer is, as you innovate on products, to get that taste and texture, there are other ingredients that are used. For instance, I was just talking to a firm yesterday that uses coconut oil from the Philippines and Indonesia in order to, fats and oils can play a part in creating the required taste, texture, and qualities like that. And you know, we all know that taste is a massive consideration for consumers, right? If it doesn't taste good, I don't care. If it's got high nutritional value, they just don't eat it. And even if it's bad for, not bad, but you know, India has, actually Asia has something like, you know, 70 to nearly 100% of incidence of lactose intolerance. But there's a huge population eating a lot of dairy, and because it tastes good, you know, it's really hard to give up. Even it may not be good for us, it tastes good, and that's a great example of how actually taste is so important. And there's another step in the value chain, which is to how to create that, and where do you source those ingredients from? And Asia does have a lot of that available.
Yeah, exactly right. And that's, I mean, that's exactly the point that you just made about taste is why at GFI, our theory of change is basically tastes the same or better and costs the same or less. Ultimately, if we have to enable consumers to switch on the basis of stuff that matters to them, those are going to be, you know, the basic factors that have to be satisfied. And then, you know, there are going to be cohorts of people that make decisions on the basis of nutrition. Maybe they're feeding their kids. Maybe they're doing different things that matter to them in their life as they go through different stages of life. And maybe it's even from meal to meal. I might care more about a specific nutrition profile after I'm working out in the gym because I have that top of mind. And then in the evening, I might go out for a drink with friends and eat something like a burger, right? Like that, it is what it is. So yeah, I think we have to round out our questions now because I want to go to questions from the audience. But before I do, I just want to ask really quickly, would both of you tell me what's making you hopeful about this biodiversity topic within the context of Asia?
I think for me, honestly, it's like out of the alternative meat scene is kind of still going to the wet markets, right? That we have in Singapore is so industrialized. You know, most people shop in supermarkets, but you go to the wet markets and you still see a huge diversity of greens available. You know, just piled on top of each other, no plastic packaging, and so you know that knowledge on how to cook these ingredients is still there. You know they're still available, people are still growing them, and the people are still buying and eating them. So that makes me hopeful that that's going to translate towards the future of food. That, you know, we're not so disconnected, and it's possible to still keep and use that knowledge in our modern day context.
I think for me, it's I see it as it's a big space. You know, it's so still really underpenetrated, the alternative protein space. Especially if you move outside of just plant-based alt proteins, you know. So especially in Asia, although tofu, mock meats, etc., have been around for thousands of years, the concept of the new alternative meats and seafood is still being explored here. And the fact that Asians are so connected culturally to their food, it bodes well for the space if it can cater to those consumer preferences. And we still remain one of the most biodiverse regions. We need to fight to protect it, and the array of crops that can be grown here gives us choice and options that we can leverage off of, despite other challenges such as infrastructure and logistics. A lot of the world actually still sources from Asia. That's already telling you what we have to offer.
Yeah, and that, I mean, for my part, I'll just underline what you both said. We are still one of the most biodiverse regions, and each and every one of our sub-regions, this Indian subcontinent, Southeast Asia, East Asia, all of these are extremely biodiverse, and we need to fight to keep it that way. And so all the innovative sectors that are taking off, we need to make sure that they include this biodiversity, they thrive off this biodiversity and feed back into this biodiversity so that 3, 5, 7, 10 years from now, my mother and I can go into the supermarket and she can pick up the millet product and I can pick up the pulses product. That's what I'm very hopeful about. So I'm going to go quickly into some of these excellent questions that are coming in from the audience. Some of them that I'm seeing are related to other sources that we didn't perhaps discuss. We kind of touched on them, but what about fermented sources of protein, fermentation derived like mycelium? You know, the investment opportunity for that. Have you seen anything in mycelium? We know it's taking off globally in a big way.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many options, right? Really, and it depends on, like, you know, the nutritional profile that the customer or the consumer expects, and then it comes down to you know, narrows down obviously your options. But then the process itself. And then the extractive process has a lot to play with it, whether you use dry extraction or wet extraction. And that's a different resource, right? You're going to do wet, you need a lot of water. So you need to have that, you know, when you extract the protein isolate. So, I mean, you know, Nithiya's mentioned algae, but algae, I mean, I love the concept of it. It has a, you know, it was looked at previously as a potential biofuel. It sequesters carbon. It has all these things. It's really cheap to produce, you know, and we actually in the region we already eat a lot of it. It's a seaweed, right? It's a blue-green, like, and then spirulina is a blue-green algae, right? And that's a whole food that has been massively marketed. You know, everyone puts it into their protein shakes. So we are well accustomed to it and we're used to it, but you know, each ingredient has other factors you need to consider, and a lot of it actually does come down to taste and texture. So for instance, algae has a really strong taste. And if you're not used to that, eating that, it has to be changed. You know, even pulses, a lot of them there's a bitterness. So you have to, there's a process that's required in order to extract, to mitigate or you know, lower that. So all these depend, you know, which ingredient you choose depends on what you want as an outcome. And then there's always, you know, steps within the value chain in order to achieve that. And it's different for every one of them. There's so many options available.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so we in the India team are super bullish on a lot of this. And, you know, you're right. With pulses, you do have to take off the bitter off tones and, you know, all of the stuff that currently makes, like, even if you were drinking a plant-based protein shake, which is not the same as a plant-based meat, it's not as complex a product as a plant-based meat, but it doesn't taste the same as whey, right? It doesn't have the same mouthfeel. It doesn't have the same rounded feeling. And people who want whey, they want, you know, dairy that comes from animals. They're craving a certain taste profile, right? So there is work to do, and it's worth doing for the sustainability reasons and the potential benefits to farmers, etc. Nithiya, I wanted to ask you a question on nutrition, because this has come up a few times now. When you're seeing consumers who come to you, who attend your sessions, who engage with you on Instagram, and you have a very active Instagram, I would encourage people to follow Nithiya on Instagram.
Thank you.
And watch her show, of course. Are you seeing consumers actually making decisions on the basis of PDCAS score and nutrition and things like that? What is the theory of change there? When we look at these trends that are colliding with plant-based, clean label, nutrition, you know, I guess nutrient dense, how are we seeing consumers actually making decisions on these bases?
So I think nutrition is definitely a key point in how people are looking at, in terms, especially for convenient foods. So like if you're talking about a protein shake, if you're talking about an after workout meal, especially for the kind of PMEB crowd, right? Nutrition is key. For new mothers, it's key. I get a lot of kind of, you know, messages asking about moringa, or like I had dengue 2 weeks ago and I was kind of foraging for papaya leaf. Because it's an old way of healing. You know, you make papaya leaf juice and then you drink it. So I think nutrition is key. I'm seeing a lot of players coming in, especially in the dehydrated instant food market. You know, like I think Kenko, where you kind of just add water, it rehydrates. It's going to give you kind of, you can have a blue spirulina, blue algae shake. You can have a beetroot shake. And it's almost like a meal replacement, right? That's kind of the angle that they're coming in at. And I think what people are looking at, especially kind of we're looking at different waves. You know, there's the people who are eating for basic survival. There is the people who are eating for pleasure. And then you have the next wave, which is eating for full-on nutrition, density, nourishment. How can I be the best version of myself types. And in that market, that's where I think a lot of the convenient future foods are coming in. And it's all about labeling. I think we need to be very clear that alternative meat doesn't always mean nutrition. So, you know, clearer labeling, making it very clear what you're going to get. So that's what I look forward to in the alternative meat, alternative plant protein market. In terms of, V was talking about mycelium. And in Asia, lion's mane, black fungus, cordyceps, reishi, these are very much a part of either herbal soups, or lion's mane is used a lot as a meat alternative in stews and stuff. But what we are lacking is the bioavailability of these ingredients. So you're taking a cocktail, you're taking a plant protein shake, but what is the bioavailability of its combination, right? Like lots of people are drinking turmeric lattes, but it doesn't make any sense if you don't add a fat base and add black pepper to make it more bioavailable. Like it just doesn't make any sense.
That is literally what I'm drinking right now, but it has black pepper in it. And I actually have, it does have black pepper in it, and I actually have to stop us right there because we have been out of time for some time now, which I didn't realize. But yeah, I guess the ultimate premise and the question that arises is, can we utilize all of this, and can we make plant-based meats nutrient dense, as you were just saying, Nithiya, and over time, will the labels get cleaner, etc. What we're seeing is we're very optimistic about that. It's definitely happening over time. Because of these infrastructure investments, we're seeing things get better over time, which is a huge cause for optimism. Elaine?